AMD first released the Zen 5 architecture back in late 2024, and at the time it quickly earned meme status as Zen 5%. That's because the performance uplift over the previous generation for general desktop usage in gaming was extremely underwhelming, so much so that I labelled it a flop and said it really wasn't worth buying until it reached the current Zen 4 pricing. However, there was one Zen 5 processor, released 3 months after the initial wave, that did receive a lot of fanfare. And that processor was, of course, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. But if we're completely honest, even the 9800X3D was pretty underwhelming. After all, it was just 7% faster than the 7800X3D, which, it's not nothing, but the MSRP was also increased by 7% to $480 US. So that was a bit of a buzzkill. Worse still, leading up to the release of the 9800X3D, the 7800X3D could regularly be had for $420, with pricing going as low as $340 US, making the 9800X3D around 14% more expensive than typical 7800X3D pricing. So in terms of value, the 9800X3D wasn't amazing, but as the world's fastest gaming CPU, demand was going to be high anyway, and as a result, it was a huge success for AMD. Currently, it can be had at or just below the $480 US MSRP, and last year we saw a very temporary sale price as low as $440 US, so with the demand so high, pricing has also remained high. Now, leading up to the CES trade show, which took place earlier this month, rumour had it AMD was working on a special version of the 9800X3D that clocked a bit higher and therefore delivered higher performance, and that model would be known as the 9850X3D. And of course, the rumours were correct. AMD did announce the 9850X3D at CES, and today we can finally show you what it has to offer. But before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by MSI's excellent QD OLED gaming monitors. Offering perfect blacks, infinite contrast, and lightning fast response times, MSI QD OLED monitors are the best way to level up your gaming experience. And there's options for everyone, whether you're after an incredible 4K panel or a blistering 500Hz refresh rate, all come with the latest features like True HDR, MSI Dark Armor film that improves black levels by up to 40%, plus uniform luminance for excellent HDR brightness curve control, along with HDMI 2.1 with full console support. So be sure to check the link in the video description to learn more about MSI's QD OLEDs. Okay, so I have to admit, when I first heard about this part, I instantly thought of Intel's stupid KS CPUs, like the 14900KS. And look, if you're an extreme overclocker, which, let's be honest, you probably almost certainly are, but if you are, the 14900KS might be an interesting product. But for everyone else who doesn't cool their CPU with liquid nitrogen, it's just a more absurd version of an already absurd product. And by that, I mean out of the box, the 14900K was already a ridiculously power-hungry processor that ran really hot as a result, and was also pretty expensive at $620 US, though it can be had today for $470 US. So selling a binned version that clocked a mere 3% higher while using over 30% more power for a 17% price premium was viewed by many as nothing more than a money grab. So, is AMD doing the same thing with the 9850X3D? Is this just a silly version of the 9800X3D? Well, of course, that is what we are here to find out today. But at least on paper, things do look reasonably sensible. Firstly, we're looking at an 8% increase in boost clocks, not massive, but certainly much better than 3%. And interestingly, the TDP has remained the same at 120 watts, so that's certainly something we'll be looking at closely. And most important of all, the price, to my surprise, it's not ridiculous. In fact, it appears quite reasonable at $500 US. That's a mere $20 over the 9800X3D, or just a 4% premium. So, let's move on to see how the 9850X3D performs, to see if it's worth that small price premium. Okay, so let's first look at how the 9850X3D behaves under load, and compare that side by side with the 9800X3D. Using Cinebench 2024's multi-core test, we found that the 9850X3D clocked at 5.32 GHz on average, just a 2% increase over the 9800X3D, and for this the core voltage increased by 12% according to the motherboard readouts. However, using our Almore Labs PMD2, an external power meter, we're looking at a massive 27% increase in power draw across the EPS power connectors, jumping up from 128 watts with the 9800X3D to 162 watts on average with the 9850X3D. So it's a little bit strange that AMD went with the same TDP rating for these parts, given the newer models do use considerably more power. That said though, the power draw from the 9850X3D is still far from extreme. It's certainly a lot for an 8-core processor, but when compared to the Core Ultra 9 285K or the 14900K, it does use very little power. Now, when comparing core clock speeds during the single core test, we see the 9850X3D clocked up to 5.62 GHz, which is an 8% increase over the 5.22 GHz the 9800X3D ran at. So as advertised, this new model does clock up to 8% higher. So here's a look at performance in Cinebench for the multi-core workload, and as the 2% increase in core clock frequency suggests, the performance uplift here is almost non-existent, just a 2% increase in this example. But for gaming, we should be seeing better gains as the 9850X3D is up to 7% faster for lighter workloads, so it will depend on how CPU heavy the game is. I won't waste much more time looking at productivity type benchmarks as the 9850X3D really isn't designed for that, and as further evidence, here is the 7-zip compression performance, where the 9850X3D was a mere 1.5% better than the 9800X3D, and then 4% better for decompression performance. Okay, jumping into the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Rainbow Six Siege. Using the medium preset, the 9850X3D was 5% faster than the 9800X3D, making it 16% faster than the 14900K and 18% faster than the older 7800X3D. Then switching to the Ultra Plus preset sees the higher end CPUs become GPU bound, so here the 9850X3D offers no real gains. The performance gains seen in Battlefield 6 are even better, at least when using the medium preset, as here the 9850X3D is 7% faster than the original model, making it 21% faster than the 14900K and 22% faster than the 285K. However, if we switch to the Overkill preset, the results for the AM5X3D processors become GPU limited, capping performance at around 200 FPS. Next we have Arc Raiders, and in this example, the 9850X3D is just 3% faster when using the medium preset, and just 8% faster with the Epic preset. Still, this meant that the 9850X3D was much faster than competing Intel processors, beating the 14900K by a 42% margin with the medium settings, while it was 47% faster than the 285K. Moving on to Borderlands 4, in this example, even the medium quality data is largely GPU limited, and that's despite using an RTX 5090. But hey, Borderlands 4 wasn't exactly known for its great optimization. So given that this data is mostly GPU limited, the 9850X3D isn't offering anything over the other high-end CPUs tested, but we'll still include the data because a lot of games do end up being GPU limited rather than CPU limited, so it is very much a real-world test. Now, testing with Marvel Rivals shows a 6% increase for the new 9850X3D over its predecessor when using the medium quality settings, but with the Ultra preset we end up heavily limited by the GPU at 160 FPS. So looking back at the medium data, we find that AMD's updated flagship is now 20% faster than the 14900K and 37% faster than the 285K. The X3D processors are Baldur's Gate 3 specialists, and you can see why. The old 7800X3D is 33% faster than the 14900K, which is impressive, but not nearly as impressive as the 60% margin enjoyed by the 9800X3D. Now we have the 9850X3D, but it can only improve upon the impressive result set by the 9800X3D by a mere 3%. So, still great performance overall, just an unimpressive uplift when compared to its predecessor. Another game where the 3D Vcache processors tend to shine is Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and here the 9850X3D is 5% faster than the 9800X3D, making it 33% faster than the 14900K and 53% faster than the 285K. However, for those of you interested in ray tracing performance, Intel's old 14900K is just as good as the 9850X3D here, which is interesting, and can't simply be explained away by more GPU limited performance, as the 9850X 3D was still 11% faster than the 285K, for example. Counter-Strike 2 runs like a dream on the 9850X 3D. Sure, it's just 6% faster than the 9800X 3D, but it also makes it 16% faster than the 7800X 3D, and then a massive 50% faster than the 14900K. The very high preset data is a little more GPU limited, so the X3D parts aren't as impressive, and we see that the 9850X 3D was just 3% faster than the 9800X 3D. Space Marine 2 needs all the CPU help it can get, so unsurprisingly, the 9850X 3D does offer a little extra oomph here, boosting frame rates by 5%, seen when using either the medium or ultra presets. And as a result, the 9850X 3D was 35% faster than the 14900K and 43% faster than the 285K. Mafia the Old Country is a mostly GPU limited title, even with the medium preset, so unsurprisingly the 9850X 3D doesn't offer much in the way of extra performance, basically just matching the 9800X 3D. Like Baldur's Gate 3, ACC plays very well with the 3D Vcache processors, and being that it is a lightly threaded game, the 9850X 3D enjoys its biggest gains in this title, boosting performance by a whole 7%. Wowee. Still, that did make it 21% faster than the 7800X 3D, and almost 60% faster than the 14900K, while the 285K gets completely annihilated by a 93% margin. Yikes. I thought we might have seen a 6 to 7% gain in Spider-Man 2, but here the 9850X 3D was just 1.5% faster when using the medium preset, so no real performance gains here then. That said though, with the ultimate ray tracing preset, we do see a 6% uplift, which was enough to just overtake the 14900K. And speaking of which, we have another example where the Core i9 processor does very well with ray tracing enabled, easily beating parts like the 7800X 3D, so that's interesting to note. The Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered results are also quite interesting because when using the medium preset, the 9850X 3D was just 2% faster than the 9800X 3D, but with the very high preset, it was 5% faster. Not a massive difference, I know, but clearly the very high quality preset is more CPU demanding when compared to the medium preset. Finally, we have The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, and here we're looking at a 6% increase for both presets tested. The 14900K results are again interesting because although the 1% lows are much lower than that of the 9850X 3D and 9800X 3D, the average frame rate is slightly higher, and this was seen when using both presets. Okay, so here's the 14 game average, calculated using the GeoMean, and as you can see, the 9850X 3D was 5% faster than the 9800X 3D, which really was to be expected, though with some of the ultra quality testing reaching the limits of the RTX 5090, the 9850X 3D was limited to just a 3% margin there. But if we focus on the medium quality data, we see that when mostly CPU limited, the 9850X 3D is 15% faster than the 7800X 3D, 28% faster than the 14900K, 34% faster than the 9700X, 40% faster than the 285K, and then 43% faster than the old, much-loved 5800X 3D. And for those of you interested, here's a look at how the 9850X 3D and 9800X 3D directly compared across the 14 games tested. When calculating the percentages on a per game basis, we get a slightly different average. Using this method, the newer model was just 4% faster on average, based on the medium quality data, so really much of a muchness, and it means overall we are looking at a very small increase. When compared to the 7800X 3D, we found a more impressive 14% improvement, with gains as large as 24% seen in Baldur's Gate 3, though we only saw low single-digit gains in Mafia the Old Country. When compared to the Ryzen 7 9700X, the 9850X 3D was 34% faster on average, and most games did see strong performance gains. The only real exceptions here being Borderlands 4, which was GPU limited, even with the medium preset, and we saw much the same in Mafia the Old Country. Baldur's Gate 3 is an extreme outlier when it comes to performance gains, but we did see over 40% gains in 3 other titles. The 9850X 3D also easily beat the Core i9-14900K in most of the games tested, with the only curious result seen in The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, though the 1% lows of the AMD processor were much better. Borderlands 4 was again GPU limited on these higher end CPUs, and then we saw semi-competitive performance in Spider-Man 2 and Mafia: The Old Country. The 14900K was swept aside in Arc Raiders, Counter-Strike 2, ACC, and Baldur's Gate 3. Then we have the matchup with the 285K, which, to be honest, isn't really a matchup at all, at least when focusing exclusively on gaming. Here we found that the 9850X 3D was twice as fast in Baldur's Gate 3, and almost twice as fast in ACC. The performance uplift in Counter-Strike 2 and Cyberpunk 2077 was also massive. Another performance-related aspect of gaming that we can look at is shader compilation time, and we'll start by looking at Marvel Rivals. As expected, the 9850X 3D is almost identical to the 9800X 3D here, taking 205 seconds, which is 32% longer than the 14900K and 44% longer than the 285K, as those parts can put their many E-cores to work on this task. Now, waiting almost 4 minutes for shaders to compile on a 9850X 3D, it's not terrible. After all, you really only need to do it once, or possibly after a driver update, but you're also still looking at a little over 2 minutes with the 285K. So for something that you rarely do, this isn't a big deal in my opinion, but it is also something AMD will want to address with future generations if things get a bit more competitive, as it is currently a weakness. I realise that the 9850X 3D is not really designed to go up against core-heavy parts like the 14900K or 285K. You'd probably look to something like a 9950X 3D, but that part is also much more expensive. Anyway, AMD could improve their multi-core performance at the lower to mid-range of their stack for future generations, I guess is my point. We're also seeing similar results when measuring shader compilation time in Stalker 2. Here the 9850X 3D took 238 seconds, making it 2% faster than the 9800X 3D, but also 34% slower than the 14900K and 44% slower than the 285K. Shader build time in The Last of Us Part 1 is particularly brutal, though I should add that you can still play all of these games when compiling shaders, it just might negatively affect frame rate performance as the CPU utilization will be maxed out. Anyway, here the 9850X 3D was just 1% faster than the 9800X 3D, making it 18% slower than the 14900K and 38% slower than the 285K. Something else worth looking at is power consumption, and this is probably the biggest drawback of the 9850X 3D, though it's also far from a deal breaker. And this is because the 9800X 3D was incredibly power efficient, but the 9850X 3D on the other hand pushes the silicon well outside of its efficiency window, boosting performance in The Last of Us Part 1 for example by 5%. We didn't look at that in this video, but take my word for it, it was a 5% performance uplift. And for that 5%, we do see a 24% increase in power usage. At 118 watts, it consumes almost as much power as the 9950X 3D in this game, which isn't very efficient for an 8-core processor, but even so, it does remain manageable. For gaming though, I think it's fair to say that it is efficient when compared to something like the 12900K for example, or even Intel's newer 285K. And of course, it's worlds more efficient than the 14900K. And moving on, we see that power usage relative to the 9800X 3D is even worse in Cyberpunk 2077. Again, in this example, we saw just a 5% increase in FPS performance, but that gain required a 35% increase in power usage. And I think it's fair to say that is a true KS moment. But at least we're only talking about 126 watts here, and not well over 200 watts. I find it interesting that AMD didn't adjust the TDP for the 9850X 3D, claiming the same 120 watt rating as the 9800X 3D, and although we're talking about thermal design power, the 9850X 3D did hit 163 watts, and that's a 27% increase over the previous model. So this is a very power-hungry 8-core processor. Okay, so we've analysed the benchmark results. The 9850X 3D is certainly fast, but is it good value? Well, if you want or require the very best gaming performance, then I think for $500 it's certainly not crazy, but for those after the best value high-end CPU, it's probably not going to be this. That honour probably still goes to the 7800X3D, which currently costs $100 US less than the 9850X3D, meaning the newer part is fetching a 9% premium per frame. Of course, the 9850X3D will only be slightly more expensive than the 9800X3D, and we see that in terms of cost per frame, it comes out to a mere 2% premium. So based on that, you might as well buy it if you were in the market for a 9800X3D. But for the more budget-conscious buyer, the 7800X3D is better value, and as recently as late last year, could be had for $360 US, so keep an eye out for discounts on that part before it runs out. Now, something AMD claimed in their press deck was that the second generation AMD 3D V-Cache allows for the same or very similar performance across a wide range of memory configurations. The example they provided compared DDR5 4800, so the base JetX spec, to DDR5 6000. AMD claims that across 30 plus games you'll see on average a 1% performance difference between these two memory configurations. And I will say that while that may be the case, it is a bit of a moot point given that DDR5 of any description is massively overpriced, and when available at normal pricing, which was the case for much of 2025, the cost difference between 4800 and 6000 DDR5, for example, was generally very small. Anyway, we're going to take a look at this because it could be interesting. I'm not sure what memory timings AMD used for this testing, but regardless, we've gone with our own method here. The DDR5 6000 configuration uses G.Skill CL30 memory with Expo loaded, and then the DDR5 4800 configuration uses the same memory but with no profile loaded, which sees the memory default to DDR5 4800 CL40. For reference, I'm also testing the 14900K and 285K with the same DDR5 4800 CL40 memory, and comparing that to the DDR5 7200 and DDR5 8200 configurations that I originally used to test those processors. I've tested 6 games, so let's go check out the data. First up, we have Rainbow Six Siege, and so far AMD's claims look to be holding up, as we see less than a 1% decrease in performance for the 9850X3D when pairing it with 4800 memory. On the other hand, the 14900K saw an 8 to 13% decrease, and the 285K an even larger 12 to 14% performance decrease. Certainly not massive decreases, but it means when using the medium quality settings with the slower memory, the 9850X3D ends up being 33% faster than the 14900K, whereas with the more optimal memory configurations, it was 16% faster. Next up we have Marvel Rivals, and we're again seeing a very similar story with well under a percentage point loss for the 9850X3D, so this is to say performance pretty much goes unchanged here with the slower memory. The 14900K though, that became 11% slower with the medium settings and then 6% slower with Ultra, while the 285K saw a 10 to 11% decrease. This means once again that with the slower memory, the 9850X3D is 35% faster than the 14900K, whereas it was 20% faster using the more optimal memory configurations. We did see a small 3 to 4% performance hit for the 9850X3D in Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered when using the slower 4800 memory, and the Intel CPUs did take a bigger hit, dropping in performance by 9 to 11% depending on the quality settings used. Counter-Strike 2 isn't a very memory-sensitive game to begin with, so I'm not surprised to find no real change in performance for the 9850X3D when going from 6000 to 4000 memory, and even the Intel processors see very little in the way of a performance loss. The 14900K, for example, was just 5 to 6% slower, while the 285K was only 2 to 3% slower. Looking at Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, we see that the 9850X3D sees little to no performance loss with the slower memory. Just a 4% hit with the medium preset, and then no performance loss when using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. The Core i9, on the other hand, suffered a 13% performance loss with the medium settings, and then 9% when using Ray Tracing, while the 285K was 12 to 14% slower when using the 4800 memory. Finally, I took a look at memory performance in Space Marine 2, and again, here we see little to no performance difference between the 9850X3D when using the slower 4800 memory, while the 14900K was 7 to 9% slower, and the 285K was 14% slower. So there you have it. The Ryzen 7 9850X 3D isn't nearly as silly as I first thought it might be. And it does make more sense, at least for most consumers, than the Intel KS parts have in the past. That said, it also hasn't made for the most exciting product release. Hopefully it's not the most exciting product release we see this year. I think Intel might actually get that one. But anyway, if you're after a bit more performance for a small price increase and then a massive hit to power usage, then, overall this does present as a reasonable product. There's no surprises here really. AMD's taken the world's fastest gaming processor and made it ever so slightly faster. So for those who require the absolute best gaming performance, I'm sure the 9850X 3D will be a hit, but for everyone else, it's a bit of an unnecessary release. Alternatively, if you're after no fuss, high-end gaming performance, then I'd suggest looking no further than the 7800X 3D, especially when it goes on sale, because as I said earlier, it has been available for as low as $360 US in the last few months. Of course, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to require memory for your CPU purchase, then the whole value thing kind of goes right out the window, as the cheapest 32GB DDR5 kits right now cost around $330 to $350 US. I suppose the only good news here being that the performance seen in this video, at least relative to competing parts, will remain the same for the X3D CPUs when pairing them with budget DDR5 memory. Well, maybe budget's not the right term. Less good memory might be a more correct term. Anyway, that is going to do it for this review. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to give it a like. We won't charge you anything for that. It's not a 7% premium. It's actually free. So yeah, feel free to do the free thing. You can also subscribe, also free. And then we have the join button or Patreon, which isn't free, but pretty good value, I reckon. So check that out if you're interested. It will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So some pretty cool perks there, worth checking out. But like I said, if you're not interested, perfectly fine. And yeah, that is going to do it for this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.